Want to welcome everybody to the Columbia Chamber of Commerce Issues Forum. My name is Mark James. I'm with Cypress Real Estate Partners, and I'm the chairman of the Public Policy Committee for the Chamber. And we have these issues forums monthly that are an effort to highlight critical issues that are impacting businesses or have the ability to impact business. And so pleased to be joining everybody today, even though it's via Zoom. We're trying to keep the momentum going with these forums, and so far have been very pleased with the participation. So thank you for being here today. Today, we welcome as our guests members of the Cassidy and Associates team. They are the Chamber's Washington consultants, and they're going to provide us today an update on the CARES Act and military funding and potential impact and I guess observations on the upcoming election, which is right at about 30 days away. So very pleased to have them join us here. As a few minutes of background, Cassidy and Associates is a leading bipartisan government relations firm consistently ranked among Washington's best. And I would say that that has been our experience with them so far. We date back to 2003 with Cassidy and Associates, back when the first round of the BRAC committee was doing their work, and they assisted us very successfully in the work with Fort Jackson. And so we've had a long-term relationship with Cassidy that we very much have appreciated and enjoyed. Before turning it over to Susan and her team, just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments or anything, we would ask that you enter those in the chat room, and Carl or another member of the chamber staff will get those questions to our guests today. And then also would ask that if your microphone is not already on mute, that you please go ahead and do that now, so we don't have some background noise coming through as we're going through this discussion and presentation. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Susan with Cassidy, and let's get the good fun stuff started. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Carl, for having us this morning. Suzanne Edwards with Cassidy and Associates. As Mark mentioned, Cassidy has is gratefully been a partner with the Chamber since 2003, when we came online with Ike McLeese at the time, and together with the mayor to help support and build Fort Jackson with the anticipation of the 2005 BRAC round. In 2005, we have what has since still until this day been called the biggest economic development success in the Midlands, when we not only protected the fort with the partnership of the Chamber, but helped grow it exponentially. We, since that time, with you as partners, have turned back the loss of 3,100 jobs in the 2015 Army Supplemental Programmatic Environmental Assessment, where we could have lost a major amount of jobs for the Midlands, and had such great metrics as being named a Great American Defense Community, and continue to be called one of the most military-friendly communities in the United States. It's something that the Chamber has worked really hard in partnership with the Fort and with our friends over at McIntyre to ensure it keeps happening. I want to introduce my colleagues today. Kai Anderson is our CEO, and Russ Thomason's an Executive Vice President at Cassidy. They both have a different levels of policy expertise, but more importantly today, they're here to be your political experts. I'm not sure which one's going to be Carville and which one's going to be Matlin, but we'll let them sort that one out. But before we get to that, I did want to give you a little bit of an update on what's going on in Washington. And with all full disclosure, I prepared this PowerPoint about 4 days ago, so about 3 October surprises ago. And so while we talk through some of the things that are happening in Washington, as you can imagine, and this may come up in the Q&A, things are apt to change day by day and hour by hour as we approach the election less than a month out. So with that, Carl, I'm going to do a quick update on where we are on COVID legislation, where we are in defense legislation, and then kick it over to Kai and Russ and you to have a conversation about the politics of this election.
Great.
So, let me share my screen. Can everybody see that? Can you thumbs up for me, Russ or Kai, that you're who I can see? Okay. So just as a quick update, I'm going to run through these slides, and then we'll have Susan and Carl and the team send them out afterwards. So the question we get from the chamber constantly is, where are we on COVID legislation? And the answer is it's changing hour by hour. Right now, the White House and Senate are currently negotiating a phase 5 COVID package. Those negotiations are largely with Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin right now. The House passed the HEROES Act in May. The Senate introduced the HEALS Act, which is a series of 8 pieces of legislation which have not been taken up on the Senate floor at this time, and negotiations continue. I know that some on this call have interest in funding for the defense industrial base. The Senate package for HEALS has a significantly a higher amount of funding for defense industrial base. HEROES, as initially introduced, contained no defense funding. As of last week, Speaker Pelosi reintroduced a new negotiation package starting as $2.4 trillion with the hopes of opening up talks with the White House. But the question in bold is, will the president's diagnosis change the politics and negotiations? I'm sure that Russ and Kai may have some opinions on that as we get to their portion of the presentation. As far as defense legislation, I know we've talked on previous Military Affairs Committee calls about the Defense Community Infrastructure Project. It is a program that was set up by Congress a few years ago to give communities the ability to make off-base improvements using federal funding. DCIP was funded for the first time this year, and they had their first competition. The chamber made a strategic decision to not compete this year and use this year as a lessons learned year. It's the first year the Office of Economic Adjustment made awards. They made those awards a couple weeks ago. Some of the lessons learned is they are not as interested in wastewater, sewer projects, etc. They largely classified military quality of life projects as not even education related, but a great deal of recreational. And several of the projects funded were YMCA type partnerships off the base. So as we move into the next year of DCIP, it has been funded in the House bill. We may want to look at some opportunities to do some off-base improvements. I know we've talked about whether beautification is an issue, whether we can solve some of our transportation problems. So that's something we're going to keep our eye on going into the next year. As far as defense authorization is concerned, both the House and Senate have completed their versions of the NDAA. Staff level negotiations have ended, and we're now on to Big Four issues. It's our understanding that the Big Four gave a deadline of October 1st for other jurisdictions to weigh in on whether they have issues with some provisions in the bill. The president had threatened to veto the bill based on the naming of bases that are named after Confederate generals. So there is not an appetite, as you can imagine, to get these bills off the deck before the November election. And as you can imagine, and as you know from the past, defense authorization also is one of the last vehicles to often leave the station, usually passing close to Christmas time. So this is not unusual. There are just some additional politics. I would like to flag that we had a cost overrun on the trainee barracks that we are currently building. And so thanks to the hard work of our congressional delegation, we were able to get an additional $7 million authorized for a phase 2 of our trainee barracks complex, phase 3, using previously in program funds. This is a big win, and we really appreciate the hard work of our delegation on this. As far as appropriations go, the House has marked up and passed 10 out of 12 appropriations bills, including defense and MilCon appropriations. The Senate's not marked up any bills at this time. As you can imagine, based on electoral politics and the SCOTUS nomination, it's unlikely we'll see those before the election. I would like to flag in a huge news story for the base. House appropriators added additional MilCon for Fort Jackson, and they were one of the few big winners in this. An additional $42.2 million was added for 2 cost to complete projects and 1 unfunded requirement. At the commanders conference last week, General Beagle indicated that within this 10-year aperture, the base is going to see about $250 million of investment going into it in MilCon, and an additional $100 million in SRM, so sustainment, restoration, and modernization. The Army is investing in Fort Jackson, which is a great news story, but we need to keep our eye on the ball as we continue to make sure that they make those investments, that we keep our training mission strong, and that we avoid news stories like the one that came out of Parris Island last week. And I'm sure we can talk about that when we get to the Q&A. As far as the government's open, the Congress passed a continuing resolution last week through December 11th. As you can imagine, the Senate legislative calendar has been pushed due to the SCOTUS nominations and also due to at least 3 senators being diagnosed with COVID-19. And so we can give our best guess, but as far as funding the government into the next fiscal year, that is largely dependent on how the election turns out. And I just wanted to flag one more issue before I turn it over to Kai and Russ. A couple weeks ago, the Air Force released the Supportive Military Families analysis. And so what this does is it gives us a snapshot as far as quality of life is considered for the Midlands, thanks to our friends at McIntyre. The initiative was undertaken in partnership with the National Governors Association and all the service secretaries as they look to consider quality of life factors in future basing decisions. And I know that we go back and forth on how great the Midlands is as a host to our military. And I want to flag the hard work of the governor and the military based task force and the chamber. What they've really helped us do is, if you look at the score sheet right here for McIntyre, for the supported military families, the fact that every one of those licensed portability scores is green means that your state legislature has been working hard to be a military friendly state. That's going to give us a great posture as we go into future basing decisions, whether that be for the F-35 or additional training missions at Fort Jackson. The other services are also going to be doing, we're unsure what they're going to be named, but they're also going to be doing quality of life scoring like this. And then I just like to flag the public education. We're kind of right in the middle of the bell curve, which as far as Air Force bases is concerned is a strong position to be in. So thanks for the hard work of our legislature and the partnership with our community partners in the city and the county and the state. I think we're really moving the ball on the perception of quality of life in South Carolina and how we are a great host to military and military installations and military families. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and then Carl, do you want to jump straight into the slides? Or you want to give a little bit of or the maps, or you want to give a little bit of a?
Well, I thought it would be interesting to hear. There's a couple bubbles that exist in politics, right? It's the one you're closest to, and so being in Columbia, we have a different type of bubble than the rest of South Carolina. Being in DC, Kai and Russ see things differently than we do, just as because local news is national news in DC. And so what I thought would be fun is just, let's talk about this election, the 2020 national election, what it means. The balance of powers is obviously at stake here, and the ripple effect is huge, especially for our delegation and what it means to South Carolina. So what, Kai and Russ, thanks for joining. Would love to get your perspective, just one on obviously presidential, Senate, whatever you want to talk about. The Electoral College, you got a great graph for that. But then I really challenge anybody on the call to let's ask questions, let's talk about what's going on, what do you think's happening, and have some dialogue. So with that, I'll kick it back.
Sure, great. Suzanne, do you want to put up slides and I can kick it off? First, while Suzanne is pulling up a couple of slides to help guide our conversation, just want to echo her thanks to you all for giving us the honor of representing you. And as you heard from the long history we have with the Chamber, this has been a long-term engagement for us, and everything we do is, although it may be tailored to the politics of the particular day, everything we do is designed around being able to withstand changes in political climate in Washington, D.C. And you have to retailor, obviously, with a change in a president, change in House, change in Senate, those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you know, in order to have long-term sustainability and good fortune in an endeavor like this, you have to be ready for anything, because if nothing else has been learned in the past 4 or 5 years, predicting elections is really difficult. So we're going to walk through a set of just 3 slides. There's a lot of information here, and we won't get to all of it, but just by way of sort of framing up our thinking. And I don't know, Suzanne, if this can go to full screen or not. The slide you see in front of you is a slide of all of the House races. And so every single race in the country is shown here by congressional district. If you were to draw a line straight down the middle from top to bottom through the blue box in the center, you would have 217 seats on either side and the 218th seat in the middle. And so these are sort of color coded by starting on the far left, appropriately enough. Dark blue are safe Democratic seats. And you can just see at first glance, California's got a ton of them. Texas has a bunch, New York has a bunch, et cetera. On the far right, you've got safe Republican seats. And then there's a gradation to likely lean, and then eventually to toss-up seats, which are shown in the yellow. The reason I'm starting with the House is because I think the House is the simplest from a predictive standpoint. Just looking at this, if only the seats that are currently safe or lean Democratic go Democratic, Democrats will control the House of Representatives. That's if they win no toss-up seats, and again, just win those that are safe or leaning Democratic. And so that's actually a pretty safe bet. And if you were to look at that would, if it went as I just described, Democrats would have a 6-seat majority, right? Because they have all of the seats to the left of the center line plus 6 seats in the center and to the right of the center line. Well, so that's interesting. That gives you a pretty good sense that Nancy Pelosi is likely to be Speaker again next year. What it doesn't tell you, and what is probably beyond the scope of this conversation or a longer conversation, is what happens if what actually controls the agenda of the House. And I think that is largely due, or will largely reflect what the margin for control of the Democrats is, right? If they have a 6-seat majority, that's a pretty tough, tight wire to walk. If they win all of the seats in yellow here in the toss-up races, they'll have a majority of closer to 30. By way of reference, the other thing I ought to point out here, just for fun, is that South Carolina shows up in both the dark blue and the dark red, as well as the toss-up. So South Carolina 6, Mr. Clyburn's seat is in the dark blue. On the far right, you'll see that districts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 from South Carolina are safe Republican seats. And then Congressman Cunningham's seat, South Carolina 1, is showed in that goldenrod or yellow color right in the center. So you guys will have a better feel for your politics than we do, but that seat is consistently ranked as a toss-up, although I think in recent days, national pundits have started to view Joe Cunningham's race as slightly less difficult for him than it had been. It had been ranked as one of the 2 top pickup opportunities for Republicans, but he's done a pretty decent job of solidifying at least where he is. Whether he can win or not, I'll leave open to you all. So in any case, this is the House. Again, it's very likely to remain Democratic. The question again, in my mind, is how big is that majority? And when we come back to a conversation around what does that mean by way of agenda in the next Congress, it can be determinative. So let's move to
Hey, Kai, before you get off of that, there's a question about the independent, where are their independents represented on this map?
Yes, so the independent that should be on this map, and I don't have it colored that way for just simplicity, is Michigan 3, which is the seat that is held by Justin Amash. He is retiring, and so that'll be one of the. I'm looking for it. yeah, it's at the top of the sort of pink color. There you go, Suzanne, thank you. So that would be a Republican, sorry, an independent seat here. We'll have the same problem when we get to the Senate. Well, actually, neither of the two independents is up for re-election in the Senate, but that would be the, am I missing one, Russ or Suzanne? Not a lot of folks out of the 435 to choose to be independent in the House. It's pretty tricky territory. Your power in the House is really derived from two things: party, and if you're in the majority, you've got a big step up in that regard, and seniority. And if it'll be beyond the scope of this conversation, but if you were to look at the chairmen and chairwomen in the Democratic caucus, they've all been around basically since the dawn of time, because Democrats are sort of run by not a inviolate seniority system, but pretty close. All right, so that's the House. Let's, Russ, anything you want to add on balance of control in the House before we go to the Senate?
No, there's nothing. I think everybody is pretty much in agreement on the House that barring some huge shift that none of us are, cognizant of, the House will remain in Democrat control.
So you will have seen in our bios that both Russ and I come from Senate side leadership background. I worked for the Democratic leader. Russ worked for the Republican whip. So you may want to discount everything we've just said about the House of Representatives, but we now turn to the Senate, which currently is a 53-47 split. The majority obviously held by the Republicans. Mitch McConnell is the leader. And if you look at the upcoming races, the Republicans have the unfortunate task of defending more seats. It's a good problem to have because they've got more seats up, which means they hold them. But they have many more to defend. That's sort of shown graphically here. And, I would start by saying that this is really a 4-seat majority for Republicans going into this race, because Doug Jones in Alabama is unlikely to win re-election. I think he has done a good job for his state over the course of this term, but the politics in Alabama are super tough for a Democrat. As you can see, he's colored blue in that sea of deep red. Alabama is a state that President Trump won by nearly 30 points, and ticket splitting has become a less and less common occurrence in recent years. And so, if you think about that, he's got to have nearly 20% of the voters who vote for Trump also vote for him, and that's a tall order. So I sort of start my handicapping of the Senate from the position of Democrats needing to pick up at least 4 seats to tie. And if they do that, they're likely to have the White House at the same time, and the tiebreaker goes to the vice president. So if you take that as the frame, Democrats have to pick up 4 seats after losing Alabama. 2 of those seats are already likely headed in their direction. First, in Colorado, Cory Gardner has run a near perfect race as the incumbent Republican senator. He's a personable guy. He has a pretty good track record on the legislative front. He just passed Great American Outdoors Act, which is one of the sort of preeminent public lands and conservation laws in the last 50 years. It was actually sponsored on the House side by Joe Cunningham. So really tremendous $1 billion a year for conservation that'll go to state, local, and federal projects for outdoor recreation. That said, he's trailing outside the margin of error. He's going to have the flip problem of Doug Jones, in that he's running in a state that Trump lost by 5 points, that Trump is likely to lose by much more. And again, he would have to attract virtually every independent voter and some Democrats to win, and that's highly unlikely. Same is true in Arizona. From the perspective, Senator McSally is running for re-election. If you follow politics closely, you will remember that Senator McSally was appointed to John McCain's seat after she lost a race for Jeff Flake's seat to Kirsten Sinema. So she's an appointed senator. She hasn't won the seat in her own right. And although at the presidential level, for a very long time, Arizona has been Republican, in the last couple cycles, demographic trends and political trends have gone in the other direction. And Mark Kelly, who's the Democratic candidate, former astronaut, is sort of out of central casting. And he's very likely to beat Senator McSally. So that's the first two. The next two seats in the sort of toss-up category here, Susan Collins' seat in Maine and Tom Tillis's seat in North Carolina are both pretty tight races. And as you move from left to right on this pictograph, the other seats that are here, I would probably put Iowa as a more hotly contested race than Montana, but it didn't fit on my chart when I was drawing it, so I flopped them. And then it's sort of we could spend all day arguing what is next most likely to flip, whether it's Alaska, Senator Perdue seat in Georgia, the open Kansas seat. I think Russ would probably leap in here and say that it's not likely to be his former boss in Texas. Before you work down to what is probably of most interest to folks on the phone here, the South Carolina race, which, frankly, I would have put in the deep red until Jamie Harrison started raising money by the millions and now tens of millions of dollars to try to make that race competitive. I think it's likely fool's gold from a Democratic perspective, but I've been proven wrong with most of my prognostication in that race, and stand ready to be corrected by everybody on the Zoom. So once you move below that line into the deepest red, those are seats where if any of those were to flip, for example, Leader McConnell's seat, it will have been such a bloodbath that the ultimate number won't matter that much. I'll finish with this on the Senate races. Again, the margin matters, right? If you have a tied Senate, whoever is running the Senate has a very, very narrow margin, and you have to keep the vice president in town to break every tie-breaking vote. And if you're up 1 or 2, that's one thing. If you're up 5 or 6, it's an entirely different. And as Russ likes to say, if you're, everybody thinks they're king if it's a really tight margin. And senators start from a predisposition to think that of themselves. So, if they're given actual power in addition to that, it can really be a recipe for difficulty getting things done. Russ, what have I missed on this one before we go to the Electoral College?
Well, just a couple points on this. I mean, obviously, Republicans are going to have an uphill slog to keep control of the Senate. I'm a Republican, and believe me, I want the Republicans to keep control of the Senate. That said, it's a tough fight for just the points that Kai laid out. An interesting fact, I think, to keep in the backs of your minds, though, are since 1992, as far as Senate races, 9 incumbents usually win. 97% of the incumbents of races, when the presidential candidate wins their state, they win. And when the presidential candidate doesn't win their state, the incumbent wins 70% of the time. So even though the map looks very bleak for Republicans, it's a lot harder to knock off incumbent senators than at first blush. So in the end, and we'll talk about this more later, it's all about turnout. And that's going to be the big question, not only in these races, but obviously in the presidential race as well. So, Kai?
Yeah, Russ's point is a great one there. And again, I would flop Iowa and Montana based on exactly that. There's an error or an omission on the map here. Montana went for Trump by 22 points last time. And so that's another reason Iowa sort of belongs further to the left than Montana. And if you look at polling, presidential polling this go round, you've got the same issue this time. So,
hey, Kai, let me interrupt, but I heard y'all correctly, right? There's potential to have even more gridlock than what we currently have.
So the point was, if you have, I'm not sure it would be gridlock, but if you have, say, for the sake of argument, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president, but the Senate is 51-49 or 50-50 with the tie-breaking vote going to the vice president, the agenda that Democrats can move in the Senate will be very different agenda than if they've got 56 and they've got a margin of 40 extra House seats. Which is why I say control matters the most, and control matters for who sets the agenda in the House floor and on the Senate floor. But at the end of the day, the margin matters a lot about what kind of legislation you can move and at what rate with what dispatch. And, you know, if we have time to discuss sort of the first 100 days of the next administration, we could get to that. But I guess that's the point, Carl.
Okay.
And Carl, to answer your question, that's why you hear a lot of talk about eliminating the filibuster in the Senate, because in order to pass legislation through the Senate, you need 60 votes. Almost all legislation. There are exceptions, for sure, but by and large, it takes 60 votes to pass legislation in the Senate. So that is where you get, where the parties are forced to, agree on something, right? There is talk, right, if the Democrats take control, that they will eliminate the filibuster, which then would mean that you would only need a majority to pass legislation in the Senate. So the Senate would become a version of the House. And so that would change the dynamics altogether in terms of, the debate that would shape what legislation would move. It would become more of a debate between moderate and left-wing Dems more so than Republicans who would be willing to work with Democrats to pass legislation in the Senate when it takes 60 votes, if that makes any sense.
So let's, Suzanne, let's go to the Electoral College for a minute. These were the sort of warm-up bouts, I think, for the race that everybody's paying attention to, which is the presidential. So this is a little bit of a confusing graphic until I walk you through it. But this is something I put together because it helps me sort of understand various scenarios in the Electoral College. So as you know, there are 538 Electoral College votes. So you have to have 270 to win a presidential race. This chart is basically broken into two equal halves of 269 votes. The center line, which runs between Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin here, is the dividing line. So one presidential candidate must win in one full half of this plus one in order to win the presidential race. And the reason I like this graphic display better than a geographic display is that it really shows you and gives your mind the ability to run through different permutations of how you get to 270. And nothing on here is a surprise. If you follow politics, you know from the last election that President Trump won the presidency basically by threading the needle of winning the upper Midwest and Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And he had already won Florida and Arizona. And this shows the route to victory for him again. Includes Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin, North Carolina, but he also has to pick up either Michigan or Pennsylvania. Right now, I think if you look at the balance of polling, there's an edge to Vice President Biden in the race. And this graphic shows you that he really needs to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, plus one of those other states that's in toss-up territory. Since I've drawn this is now more than a week old. Some would argue that Iowa should move from the center right there into the pink, or maybe even into the yellow, as polling has moved in Biden's direction pretty substantially there. Some folks put Ohio in the yellow color. I think Georgia and Texas are still a long shot, and Democrats who get tempted about making runs at those states are spreading resources pretty thin and probably running a pretty substantial risk. If Joe Biden wins Texas, Joe Biden's going to have 350 electoral votes, so it's not going to have mattered that much. In the light blue, there are a couple of things to watch there. I think states like Nevada are not as blue as some people think they are, and neither is New Hampshire. President Trump lost New Hampshire very narrowly. Polling isn't great for him there right now, but there are a couple of states here along that light blue to yellow line that could be put back in play if Trump were to change the direction of this race. You will have seen that he has tried to do that in Minnesota, which is one of the states he felt like he could break through. Polling doesn't suggest that he's been successful so far, but that's certainly one of the places he's focused. So look, if you turn on the television, if you make the mistake of turning on the television and watching anything about politics in coming days, what you're going to see is a lot of discussion about the states of Arizona and Florida, North Carolina, the sort of Sunbelt states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the Rust Belt states, and what they mean for the outcome of the Electoral College. So that's a frame to look at this and to think about the back and forth. This also, from my perspective, as we think about sort of policy matters, this map really helps illustrate power bases for the different political parties. And, from a Democrat perspective, when you start with almost 20% of your caucus coming from California, it should be no surprise to anybody that the Californians will have some say in what a Democratic agenda looks like. By the same token, I think that, in the event Biden were to win, you'll look at states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the states that sort of push him over that line, as equally or more important than those base states of New York, California, Illinois, New Jersey, et cetera. So anyway, there is a ton of information here, most of which we won't have time to talk about, but I just wanted to give you a different way to think about the Electoral College and how it pans out. And I think with that, Suzanne, Carl, are we ready? Mark?
Ready? Let me add one thing here.
Russ.
We didn't talk about this. There are actually another colleague from a different organization calculated that there are actually 64 different possible combinations that could result in a tie of the Electoral College here at 269, 269. So, just when you think, okay, one way or another, we're going to figure it out, there could be a tie. And it's not completely out of the realm of the possible. So keep that in the back of your mind.
Actually, this map is drafted so you can see that pretty simply, right? If Biden wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the 2nd District of Maine, and Trump wins North Carolina, the 2nd District of Nebraska, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and then they both win everything they're supposed to win, that would be an Electoral College tie. And then the vote moves to the House of Representatives, where state delegations cast one vote based on the state delegation vote. And That's beyond the I think, scope of this conversation. If you want to break your brains, we could reconvene for that. But I'll skip to the punchline, which is that Republicans would very likely win that because they control more state delegations. And if you have that narrow an outcome in the Electoral College, they will likely retain those seats as well. So, or those state delegation votes as well.
That would, sorry to interrupt, but that would just be so 2020, wouldn't it?
Right, exactly, right?
Wow.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Hey, before we leave the Electoral College, a couple questions. Katie, I'm coming back to you in a second, but Dylan has a great question about the Electoral College. Some argue it's outdated, and we are only fully represented by the popular vote. Some say the Electoral College keeps vote systems fair. What say you? I would argue, I'm throwing my editorial comment, we would never, ever see a presidential candidate again in South Carolina if we did away with Electoral College. But I'll say that. Go ahead, experts.
So what I would say on that front is there are arguments for and against the Electoral College, certainly. From our perspective, my approach on things like this is that is something that is highly unlikely to change. And, you know, there are people that spend their lives trying to change things like that. From our perspective and the kind of work we do, we seek to understand the Electoral College and figure out how to work within it. It's not to say that there aren't things that are unfair about it, but there are certainly, as you point out, things that are advantageous to it with respect to forcing candidates to spend time in more places. But it's, you know, it's the task of revamping the Electoral College, you know, makes things like universal healthcare look like a walk in the park.
That's good. All right, let me throw. We're going to bounce around a little bit with Q&A, guys. If y'all have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box or the chat box, however you're comfortable. Katie's got a question about if y'all didn't. Yeah, I didn't tell y'all about this earlier this morning, but the Supreme Court ruled last night. There was a court case about whether you needed in South Carolina absentee ballots usually require a signature as a witness. And the Republicans put that in a bill earlier this year. It got thrown out by a judge, went to the Fourth Circuit, got put back in. The South Carolina Democratic Party appealed, went to the Supreme Court. They threw the appeal out, said, yes, you can actually require that. Mainly the Republicans were worried about voter fraud. And so Katie had a question, how confident are you in the protection of the votes with more absentee and early voting? I worry about increased voter fraud. So to that, the Supreme Court sided with the Republican delegation here and the governor here in South Carolina. But I know that's a fight pretty much along the lines of blue and red states, I would imagine.
Yeah, so it is and it isn't. So Katie, it's a great question. I hail from Oregon originally, and Oregon now for, I'm not going to know the length of time, but for a couple of decades has been all vote by mail. And it was driven in part by Oregon being also a big state from the perspective of ballot initiatives. And I think it has its roots in, you know, when I was first starting to vote, you would get a sort of skinny telephone book, thick list of proposals you were supposed to vote on. And if you tried to do that standing in line, you know, only 3 people would get through each polling station every day. And so the state of Oregon has voted by mail for a long time. There's really been very little, if anything, in the direction of voter fraud in that state. Folks on both sides of the aisle win races periodically. Obviously, the state leans Democratic a little bit, although the part of the state I'm from is just as red as any part of South Carolina. That I promise you. I'm out from the Idaho part of Oregon. So I think in states like that, there's really very, very low risk. I think with respect to absentee and early voting, sort of more broadly, there are systems in place that should address these things. And I voted by mail the other day, in part to get it off my list of things to do, in part to make sure that the U.S. Postal Service had enough time to get my ballot all the way across D.C. Not that my vote makes a heck of a lot of difference, but what I would say is if you're going to vote by mail, do it as early as you can, and the reason to vote early in person is to avoid a crush of a line. So, and I think if you go to a poll early, you're not going to see folks engaged in voter fraud. I think your vote's going to get counted. And, frankly, just for your own sanity, if you can go early, go early. I don't know the route. I should have looked up the rules for early voting in South Carolina. I don't know them. So
we opened up yesterday, and
yeah.
there were long lines everywhere, which was rather interesting. And following up on that, are there states that are not required to present a valid ID? I know that's been an issue. But I think we have to in South Carolina present a valid ID. I don't know any other states that require that. So sorry.
No, I think I don't know the answer to that. We could get back to you though. We could pull that information. Mark, you're on mute.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'd like to know sort of which side, Republican or Democrat, would you say currently has sort of a voter enthusiasm advantage? And it seems like most people are saying that the only way that the Trump can pull this thing out is this quote unquote silent majority. Is there anything in y'all's polling information or any questions that you ask that would indicate there's something to that, or is that sort of a wish?
So my answer to that is going to be both, and then I'll invite Russ and Suzanne to add if they have additional thoughts. I think both sides are pretty well motivated this go around. Obviously Democrats have been out of power and don't like much of anything that the president has done. But by the same token, the president has enjoyed rock solid support in the low 40s, no matter what's happening. It doesn't, usually it matters what's happening with the stock market and the economy. You would argue that it would matter, how a pandemic is being handled, all those sorts of things. His approval ratings do not move. The people that like him. They appreciate his candor and his approach and can see past, some of the let's call them idiosyncrasies of his approach to politics and policy. And they're going to be there no matter what. The question I think that you're asking, Mark, is the right one, which is, are there people that did not vote for him last time that are part of that 42%, so that his 42% slice gets bigger? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a really difficult thing to poll. The other thing I would mention just briefly is a lot of folks think that the polling was way off in the last presidential election. It wasn't that far off, actually, if at all. The states that he ended up winning were hiding in plain sight, and Secretary Clinton just failed to visit a bunch of states that ended up going by a few thousand votes to Mr. Trump. So it's part of the reason you've seen Joe Biden make repeated trips to Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They won't recreate that error. Russ or Suzanne, do you have things to add on the?
I would just, before we go to Russ, I would add, I think that Democrats are treating every day for the next 30 days as election day. That's a strategy that they have had, make a plan to vote. I'm sure folks have seen it on social media. And so just the tempo of you can vote today, I think that they will start to see in the next few weeks, like the rate of return ballots. I think I've seen in some states, Democrats seem to have an advantage in early ballot turn-in, but that's also a trend that Democrats tend to vote in that way. And it also shows a motivated voter who's clearing the deck and getting their vote out of the way right now. I don't know, Russ, you've got something to add?
Well, so hey, look, I mean, this is all going to be about turnout. I mean, if we look at the midterm election 2 years ago, 50% of the eligible voters came out and voted. And that was the highest number in 100 years. Previously, during midterm elections, you were upper 30s, low 40s. Now, in a presidential election, those numbers have been going up. So we're going to be up into the 60%. Nobody really knows. Polling is hard to do when you don't have good voter turnout models. I always tell people, hey, look, every pollster, one, is trying to sell their polling data to candidates. There's so much money in politics these days that, it's, careful what you buy, right? In terms of who you have as a poller, who you have as, doing your direct mail and all that kind of, all the various, campaign related expenses. So, we'll see. Your guess is as good as any of us on this. But I think, we will definitely have probably the highest voter turnout based upon all the enthusiasm polling that's been done, in history.
Right.
Russ, maybe I can throw over to you because we've talked, Carl and I have talked, and Susan, about no matter who wins, spending has been out of control. And part of it's because we're in an unprecedented global pandemic. But as far as the chamber and that they've really been the one keeping the eye on Fort Jackson as an economic engine in the state, whether it's BRAC or something like BRAC, what does the defense budget look like in a new administration? And is that different if it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration?
Well, the way I see defense spending, defense spending has, obviously gone up significantly, over the last, several years. I think under a, all Democrat administration, it would go up to a smaller degree than under a Trump administration. I think the thing to keep your eye on, though, is a BRAC. I think a BRAC is definitely more likely under Democrat control than Republican control. Now, of course, BRACs can be a good thing. They can be a bad thing. I mean, some, entities will say, well, a BRAC's good because we can get stuff. Some people are concerned, we could lose stuff. So a lot of it depends on your perspective, but defense funding will continue to go up for sure. The rate it goes up is going to be, of some debate, but then it also depends on what's going on in the world, right? I mean, an external threat, some sort of conflict. I mean, that can change the dynamics of all this in a heartbeat. So.
Okay. Well, great. We're kind of bumping up against the time that y'all have been generous enough to give us today, and we got a lot of folks out there that need to kind of get rolling. But really cannot thank you enough for the time this morning. Your insight has been real valuable and has offered us a lot to think about going forward. A couple things to comment on calendars coming up. Our next issues forum will be on Tuesday, November the 3rd. That is, ironically, for our conversation day, Election Day. But our conversation will shift to the DOT. We'll have Leland Colvin, the Deputy Director of the DOT, to give us an update on a number of different road projects around the Midlands, Carolina Crossroads, Elmwood Avenue, Blossom Street, moving Blossom Street over the rail lines. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. I also want to take a minute to thank our sponsors for today's Issues Forum: Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, Sign It Quick, Sun Solutions, and Wells Fargo. And also just mention, if you'll go to the Chamber website, there's some information on our Chamber golf tournament this year. we're partnering with the Chamber of Commerce in Casey, West Columbia, and Scott Middleton at the main course on Main Street will be hosting that event. A little bit different, more of a Topgolf type experience, but real excited about that. And it'll be a challenge with the West Columbia Casey Chamber of Commerce. So hopefully y'all will be able to participate in that. And I personally would like to thank all of the members and participants in today's forum for their support of the Chamber of Commerce and the business community. And if we can do anything to help you, please don't hesitate to reach out to Carl, Henry, Susan, or any other members of the Chamber team. And with that, Carl, do you have anything you'd like to add before we close it?
Well, no, I just want to thank Kai and Russ and Suzanne again for their partnership for the last 15, 17 years. It's been great. We really appreciate everything y'all do, but more importantly, being here today and give us a little bit of insights. I find this stuff fascinating, and I have turned off a lot of the news, national news, quite frankly, but I'm still a junkie at heart as it relates to politics. So this was good stuff. So thanks very much for being with us. Thanks for what y'all do for our community. We really, really appreciate it. To everybody, to our partners, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you real soon. Thanks again, Mark. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Y'all have a good day.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.